My name is Charlene Deal, and I'm the director of this festival. And I know I've said this before, but I have absolutely the best job in the world. This year, we teamed up with 5 other festivals and started plaguing Random House and said, please, please, can we please get Eleanor Catton to come back to Canada? Because we love the book. She's been singled out for the highest award that our country gives writers, the Governor General's Award, plus she snagged the Man Booker Award for this big, rollicking, sometimes very painful, and always fascinating novel, The Luminaries. And so I'm singling out for your recognition 5 festivals, of which we are one, the New Zealand Book Council and Random House for helping to fund this particular visit. I know some of you have already read this book. For those of you who have not, you are in for a treat. Please welcome Eleanor Catton.
Thank you very much for all of those welcomes and to all of you for being here. This is my first time in Winnipeg, and I'm just really chuffed to be here. I'm going to read 3 sections from the book. How's this volume? Is this okay? First, in honour of Clarence and Barbara being here, I'd like to read a section from the book that I actually don't usually read, but that involves one of the characters in the novel, a native New Zealander, a Māori man. The Luminaries, just to give you some context, is set in the 1860s in New Zealand during one of the country's gold rushes, actually the second major gold rush that we had. Māori had known for a very long time that there was gold in New Zealand. They'd probably known for hundreds of years, but they had no use for it. They didn't care that it was there. Their treasure was and is a stone known as punamu, which in Māori means simply treasure. And it's a stone that is carved into beautiful shapes and into weapons as well, and used as a means of sealing all kinds of arrangements. One of the things that really drew me to the West Coast when I was researching the book and kind of dreaming about it before I started writing was that this very small area in New Zealand saw really an intersection of economies. The west coast of the South Island is rich in gold, as was discovered in the 1860s by the Europeans. But it's also the lodestone of punamu in the country. In fact, the Māori name for the South Island is Te Wai Punamu, which means the waters of greenstone. And I so loved this idea that New Zealand, a declared bicultural country, saw this in this one region, this intersection of an economy that is based purely on value and an economy that is based purely on worth. It is impossible to buy punamu for yourself. You can't do it, because to give punamu, there's what you must do. To give it is to bestow prestige on somebody else, and you can't buy prestige for yourself. Conversely, in the case of gold is pure currency, it's pure money. So it kind of they form this quite nice pair in my mind that, to me, spoke to the bicultural nature of the New Zealand sensibility. So I'm going to read just a little bit about the Māori character in the book, whose name is Toro Taufare. The iwi to which Taufare belonged was Putini Ngaitahu, a people who had once commanded the entire western coast of the South Island, from the steep-sided fjords in the south to the palms and stony beaches in the far north. 6 years ago, the Crown had purchased this extensive tract of land for a sum of £300, reserving for Putini Ngaitahu only the Arohura River, sections of its banks, and a small parcel of land at Mawhera, the mouth of the River Grey. The negotiations had at the time struck Putini Ngaitahu as unfair. Now, 6 years later, they knew the purchase to be patent theft. The thousands and thousands of diggers who had since flocked to the coast in pursuit of gold had each purchased a prospector's license at £1 apiece and land at a price of 10 shillings per acre. That profit alone was considerable, but that was to say nothing of the value of the gold itself, hidden in the rivers and mingled in the sands, whose aggregate value was so colossal it had not yet been given a figure. Every time he thought about the wealth his people ought to have commanded, Taufare felt a swell of anger in his chest, an anger so bitter and tormented that it manifested as pain. Thus it was to the Crown and not to Putini Ngaitahu that Crosby Wells had paid his £50 when he purchased 100 rolling acres at the eastern end of the Arahura Valley, an acreage that was thick with totara, a finely grained wood that answered well to a knife and did not weather under salt or storm. Wells was pleased with his purchase. His two great loves were hard work and hard work's reward, whiskey when he could get it and gin when he could not. He built himself a one-roomed cottage overlooking the river, cleared a space for a garden, and began to build a timber mill. Toro Taufare travelled up the Arahura Valley relatively frequently for the reason that he was a hunter of pounamu, and the Arahura River was filled with that treasure, smooth, milky grey stones that, when split, showed a glassy green interior harder than steel. He was a competent carver, even some said an excellent one, but it was in sourcing the stone from the riverbed that he was truly and uniquely skilled. Pounamu was as dull and ordinary on the exterior as it was bright and iridescent within. Taufare, with his practiced eye, did not need to scratch or split the stones at the riverbank, but carried them back to Mafera untouched so that they could be blessed and broken in the ceremonial way. The acreage purchased by Crosby Wells banked onto Putini Ngaitahu land, or as we should properly say, banked onto the portion of land to which Putini Ngaitahu had been so recently confined. In any event, it was not long before Toro Taufare encountered Crosby Wells, having been attracted by the sound of Wells's axe ringing through the valley as he split kindling for his fire. Their acquaintance began cordially and became frequent. Over time, Taufare began to call in at Crosby Wells's cottage each time he was near. Wells, it turned out, was an enthusiastic pupil of Maori life and lore, and so Taufare's visits became a tradition. So that's just a little piece from the early on in the book. Thank you. Crosby Wells, at the time when the novel begins, has recently died, and much of the novel is concerned with figuring out how he died and if he was murdered, and if so, by whom. So I'm going to read another section now where a couple of people are discussing his recent death. So these are men in the town of Hokitika who are implicated by his death. I think that's all I need to tell you. Yes, okay, I'll just keep reading. At midday on a Saturday, Harold Nielsen could usually be found in his office, sitting before a stack of contracts, wills, and bills of lading, patting his breast every 10 minutes or so to check again the silver pocket watch that would release him to his luncheon, which he took with medical regularity each day at the Nonpareil. Nielsen recommended this routine to any who would listen, believing very stoutly in the curative properties of dark gravy, pastry, and ale. He did much recommendation, in fact, and often made an example of his own customs for the profit of other, less visionary men. He derived an especial pleasure from argument, so long as it was of the preposterous hypothetical variety, and so loved to fashion absurd theories of abstraction from the small but dedicated circle of his own tastes. This attitude was affectionately reinforced by his friends who thought him vivacious and amusing, and scorned by his detractors who thought him affected and self-absorbed. But these latter voices were subdued in Nielsen's ears, and he spent no effort to better make them out. Harold Nielsen smoked a pipe, a fat calabash with a bitten-down stem, though his affection for the instrument had less to do with the pleasures of the habit than for the opportunity for emphasis it provided. He often held it in his teeth unlit and spoke out of the corner of his mouth like a comic player delivering an aside, a comparison which suited him, for if Nielsen was vain of the impressions he created, it was because he knew that he created them very well. Today, however, the mahogany bowl was warm, and he was pulling on the stem with considerable agitation. The hour of his luncheon was past, but he was not thinking of his stomach, and nor of the ruddy-cheeked barmaid at the nonpareil who called him Harry and always saved the choicest edges of the pie crust for his plate. He was frowning down at a yellow bill upon his desktop, and he was not alone. At length, he pulled his pipe from his teeth and lifted his eyes to meet the gaze of the man sitting opposite him. He said in a low voice, "I've done no wrong. I've done nothing below the law." "It's who stands to profit," said Joseph Pritchard. "That's what a justice will be looking for. Seems you made a very tidy profit by this man's death." "By the legal sale of his estate, which I took on after he was already in the ground." "In the ground, but warm, I think." "Crosby Wells drank himself to death," said Nielsen. "There was no cause for an inquest, nothing untoward. He was a drunk and a hermit, and when I received these papers, I believed his estate would be small. I had no idea about the bounder." I should just pause here to mention that a great fortune on the Hokitika goldfields was referred to as a homeward bounder because it was enough money to be able to go home on. "I had no idea about the bounder. You're saying this was just a lucky piece of business. I'm saying I've done nothing below the law." "But someone has," Pritchard said. "Someone is behind this. Who knew about the bounder? Who waited till Crosby Wells was 6 feet deep, then sold off his land so quiet and so quick, without ever going to auction? Who put the papers in? And who planted my laudanum under his cot?" "You say planted." "It was planted," Pritchard said. "I'll take my oath on that. I never sold that man a dram. I know my faces, Harold. I never sold a single dram to Crosby Wells." "Well, then there you are. You can prove that. Show your records and receipts." "We have to look beyond our own part in this design," Pritchard said. When he spoke vehemently, he did not raise his voice, but lowered it. "We're associated. Trace it back far enough and you'll find an author. It's all of a piece." "Do you suggest this was planned in advance?" Pritchard shrugged. "Looks like murder to me," he said. "Conspiracy to murder," Nielsen corrected him. "What's the difference?" "The difference is in the charge. It would be conspiracy to murder. We'd be convicted for the intention, not for the act itself. Crosby wasn't killed by another man's hand, you know." "So we've been told," Pritchard said. "Do you trust the coroner, Mr. Nielsen? Or will you take a spade in your own hands and bring the hermit's body up?" "Don't be ghastly. I'll tell you this, you'll find more than one corpse in the hole." "Don't," I said. "Emery Staines," Pritchard said relentlessly. "What the devil happened to him if he wasn't killed? You think he turned to vapour?" "Of course not." "Wells died, Staines vanished, all in a matter of hours. Wells is buried 2 days later, and what better place to hide a body than in another man's grave?" Let's stop there. Ominously. The hanging sign outside the Wayfarer's Fortune had been repainted so that the jaunty silhouette with his Dick Whittington bundle was now walking beneath a starry sky. If the stars formed a constellation above the painted figure's head, Mannering did not recognize it. He glanced up at the sign only briefly as he mounted the steps to the veranda, noting as he did so that the knocker had been polished, the windows washed, the doormat replaced, and a fresh card fitted into the plate beside the door. Mrs. Lydia Wells, medium, spiritist, secrets uncovered, fortunes told. At his knock, he heard female voices and then quick footsteps on the stairs ascending. He waited, hoping that it would be Anna who received him. There was a rattling sound as the chain was unhooked. Mannering touched the knot of his necktie with his fingers and stood a little straighter, looking at his faint reflection in the glass. The door opened. "Dick Mannering." Mannering was disappointed, but he did not show it. "Mrs. Wells," he exclaimed, "a very good evening to you." "I certainly hope it will be, but it is not the evening yet." She smiled. "I would expect you, of all people, to know that it is dreadfully unfashionable to arrive early to a party. What would my mother call it? A barbarism." "Am I early?" Mannering said, reaching for his pocket watch in a pretense of surprise. He knew very well that he was early. He had desired to arrive before the others so as to get a chance to speak with Anna alone. "Oh yes, look at that," he added, squinting at the watch. He shrugged and tucked it back into the pocket of his vest. "Must have forgotten to wind it this morning. Well, I'm here now, and so are you, dressed for the occasion. Very handsome indeed." She was wearing widow's weeds, though her costume had been enhanced, as she might have phrased it, in various small ways, and these enhancements belied its sombre tone. The black bodice had been embroidered with vines and roses, stitched in a glossy thread, so that the designs winked and flashed upon her breast. She wore another black rose upon a band of black that was fitted as a cuff around the plump whiteness of her forearm, and a third black rose in her hair, pinned into the hollow behind her ear. She was still smiling. "What am I to do now?" she said. "You have put me in a dreadful position, Mr. Mannering. I cannot invite you in. To do so would only encourage you to arrive early on other occasions. Before long, you would be inconveniencing men and women of society all over town. But I cannot turn you out into the street either, for then you and I will both be barbarians, you for your impudence, and me for my inhospitality." "Seems there's a third option," said Mannering. "Let me stand on the porch all night while you mull it over, and by the time you make up your mind, I'll be right on time." "There's another barbarism," said Mrs. Wells, "your temper." "You've never seen my temper, Mrs. Wells." "Have I not?" "Never. With you, I'm a civilized man. With whom are you uncivilized, one wonders." "It's not a matter of with whom," said Mannering. "It's a matter of how far." There was a brief pause. "How grand that must have felt," said Mrs. Wells presently. "When?" "Just then," said Mrs. Wells. "What you just said, it must have felt grand." "There's a certain style about you, Mrs. Wells, I'd forgotten it." "Is there?" "Yes, a certain style." Mannering reached into his pocket. "Here's the tariff. Daylight robbery, by the way. You can't charge 3 shillings in Hokitika for an evening's entertainment, not if you're calling up Helen of Troy. The fellows won't stand for it. Though I oughtn't to be giving you advice. As of this evening, you and I are direct competitors. Don't think that I don't know it. It'll be the Prince of Wales or the Wayfarer's Fortune when the boys turn out their pockets of a Saturday night. I'm a man who takes notice of my competition, and I'm here tonight to take notice of you." "A woman likes to be noticed," said Mrs. Wells. She accepted the coins, then pulled the door wide. "Anyway," she added, as Mannering stepped into the hall, "you're a rotten liar. If you'd forgotten to wind your watch, you wouldn't have been early. You'd have been late." She shut the door behind him and set the chain. "You're in black," Mannering observed. "Naturally," she returned. "I am recently widowed and therefore in mourning." "Here's a fact," Mannering said. "The colour black is invisible to spirits. I'll make a bet you didn't know that, did you now? It's why we wear black at funerals. If we dressed in colour, we'd attract the attention of the dead. Wearing black, they can't make us out." "What a charming piece of trivia," said Mrs. Wells. "Do you know what it means, though? It means that Mr. Staines won't be able to see you, not in that gown. You'll be quite invisible to him." She laughed. "Dear me, well, there's nothing to be done, I suppose, not at this late stage. I shall have to call the whole evening off." "And Anna," said Mannering, "what colour will she be wearing tonight?" "Black, as a matter of fact," said Mrs. Wells, "for she is in mourning also." "You're scuppered," said Mannering, "the whole enterprise, and all on account of your gowns. How's that for a stick in the wheel? Thwarted by your own gowns." Mrs. Wells was no longer smiling. "You are irreverent," she said, "to make sport of the tokens of bereavement." "You and I both, Mrs. Wells." They looked at each other for a moment, each searching the other's expression. "I have the greatest respect for swindlers," said Mannering presently. "I ought to, seeing as I count myself among them. But fortune-telling, that's a poor swindle, Mrs. Wells. I'm sorry to say it plain, but there it is." Her expression was still cautious. Lightly she said, "How so?" "It's nothing better than a falsehood," said Mannering stoutly. "Tell me the name of the next man to bet against me. Buy me into my next game of brag. Give me the winner of next week's races. You wouldn't do it, would you? No, you wouldn't, because you can't." "I see that you like to doubt, Mr. Mannering." "I'm an old hand at this game, that's why." "Yes," said the widow, still gazing at him. "You relish doubting." "Give me the winner of next week's races, and I'll never doubt again." "I cannot." Mannering spread his hands. "There you have it. I cannot, because in asking me for such a thing, you are not asking me to tell your fortune. You are asking me to give you an incontrovertible proof of my own ability. That is what I cannot do. I am a fortune-teller, not a logician." "Poor fortune-teller, though, if you can't see ahead to next Sunday." One of the first lessons one learns in this discipline is that nothing about the future is incontrovertible, said Mrs. Wells. The reason is very simple. A person's fortune always changes in the telling of it. You're feathering your own nest with that argument. She lifted her chin slightly. If you were a jockey in next week's horse race, and you came to me and asked to know if your fortune was likely good, well, that would be a different story. If I pronounced that your fortune was very gloomy, you would likely ride poorly because you would be dejected. If I made a favourable forecast, you would likely ride with confidence and thus do well. All right, I'm not a jockey, said Mannering, but I am a punter with 5 pounds riding on a mare called Irish, that's the truth. And I'm asking you to tell my fortune, good or bad. What's my forecast? She smiled. I doubt your fortunes would be very much altered by the loss or gain of 5 pounds, Mr. Mannering, and in any case, you are still seeking proof. Thank you.
I know one book that's going to get signed. So I have about 1 million questions, and this book is so large that it probably could sustain about 2. But I'm going to start with one that comes out of your comment about the luminary's face, your partner's, because this is such a wildly full and fully imagined world that you've created with a lot of characters. So I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about your process of arriving at the characters, but also how did you keep track of so many? Because it's quite a large village you've invented here.
Yes. Well, to answer the second part first, a lot of lists. And a lot of supporting documents in and around the manuscript that I was working on. You know, at every point in the process, I would be trying to define what it was that I was trying to do to myself, writing plot summaries, writing kind of thematic manifestos, writing defenses of what it was that I was grasping towards. Each in a new document. You know, scene breakdowns, all sorts of things that relate to the structure of the book, I guess, as well, which I should probably talk about. The way that the cast of the luminaries is designed is that each one of the characters is modelled on a celestial archetype, in the sense that there are 12 men who in the book are each drawn in by their association to the death of this man, Crosby Wells. And each of these 12 men typify in their behaviour and in their being one of the 12 signs of the zodiac.
Oh, hello.
That was a kind of, yes, something from the heavens.
The sun just came up.
Very Leo thing, you know.
So we've got kind of the 12 there. That took. I suppose that was the first thing that I had to lay down in terms of choreography, and I really worked from the archetypes outward. This is a way of working that I think I would probably never do again, because the zodiac is so particular to it's so rich in character already. And it is a system of archetypes more than anything else. I always feel like it's very important to say at the outset that an archetype and a stereotype are completely different things. That a stereotype is a reduction of a person. It's a reduction of a person into a trait or a series of traits. It's smaller than a person. Whereas an archetype is a mold, it's a form really, and there are infinite ways to fill it. There isn't one way to be a Taurus or one way to manifest a lunar a characteristic. You know, these are forces and shapes that for thousands of years we've been creating. We've been projecting our inner lives up onto the sky, and now for whatever reason,
however you want to explain it, this system of archetypes has become a system that I was quite astonished to discover in my research has robustness. You know, it has internal harmonies. It has integrity as a system. So anyway, the 12 signs of the zodiac, to start with them, I was really captured by this idea that I could try and create a system where I would write a mystery story. It would begin with a death, as most good mystery stories do, and that these 12 men would be all pulled in this very peripheral way to this affair. None of them would have murdered the person in question. I knew that from the beginning, but they would all be associated in a way that implicated them. So I kind of had this idea, and I started looking at the 12 signs of the zodiac and thinking, how can I make these archetypes manifest? And some of them presented themselves to me very easily. So, for example, Cancer is associated with the fourth house. It's the fourth sign of the zodiac. It's associated with the home. It's known as the house of hearth, is how astrologers describe it. So I thought, all right, I'll make him a hotel keeper, because that'll make sense of that. And I also knew, for example, that Cancer is ruled by the moon. So I thought, okay, I'll take my lunar character and I'll make her live in the hotel that he's the hotel keeper of. You know, so there were kind of little things like this that got put in place bit by bit. And some of the ideas were bad ideas, and I kind of sat with them for a while and then tossed them out. But gradually this picture started emerging. You know, I had to start thinking, for example, okay, what relation could a Virgo have with a death? You know, and how am I going to make use of those archetypal traits? So I'd kind of go away and do a little bit of research, find out about the mythology behind the sign. I was researching the history of the zodiac as I went, and kind of the pictures started becoming clear in a way. And I think that, I mean, to answer the other part of your question, which is why, how on earth this order didn't just kind of come tumbling down, which it did periodically, you know. Well, I think that the really interesting thing about the zodiac is how complete it is in terms of covering all the bases of human impulse. And to understand that, I kind of need to go over to the planets, the 7 astrological planets, who in my book are also characters. And they're kind of the real movers and shakers of the story. The story really belongs to them rather than to the 12 zodiacal characters. I was astonished to discover, for example, that if you take the 7 planets and arrange them into 3 pairs with 1 remainder, you essentially get a very Freudian understanding of the way that the mind works. So, for example, the sun and the moon together are known as the luminaries. They govern your self, with the sun governing all that you display to the world, your outermost self, and the moon governing all that you keep hidden at a cost, perhaps, to all that you display. And this forms the ego together. So when we talk about, what is your sign? I'll say, okay, well, I'm a Libra. This actually only is half the picture because, well, really it's only a very tiny part of the picture, astrologers would say, but it's certainly only half of the ego. Because everything that you display to the world, everything that's visible, there is something else going on. There is your moods, your emotional self, the kind of the feminine counterpart to the masculine show, if you like. This is kind of a very Jungian idea, the animus and the anima. Venus and Mars, who in my book are a scheming couple. I've always loved scheming couples in murder mystery stories. My top scheming couple are from the Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White. I think it has the ultimate scheming couple. And also from The Portrait of a Lady, another wonderful scheming couple. I won't say who they are in case you haven't read it, and I don't want to spoil it. But anyway, Venus and Mars, again, like in a pair, they operate in tandem, where Venus governs what it is you desire, what it is that you want, and Mars governs how it is you're going to get it. So they again work together. And this, you could say, is the id, you know. Moving outward to the larger planets, Jupiter and Saturn again work as a pair. With Jupiter governing our convictions, our kind of our social sense, our beliefs, who in my book is a politician, and Saturn, the counterpart, governing how we manage time, you know, how we, our doubts and fears and everything that kind of goes alongside conviction that is necessary to balance it out, or belief. And here we've got the superego. So with these three pairs, you know, it's a very intelligent way of understanding the inner self, the self that relegates the kind of your immediate interaction with the world, and then the way that you conceive of the abstract. But of course, there's one planet left over, which is Mercury. And Mercury, I mean, the zodiac takes care of this as well, because Mercury is the planet that governs our reason and our communication, obviously the messenger god, but also trickery and deceit, because Mercury is so allied to the truth and to the message that Mercury cares nothing for either the person sending the message or the person receiving it. So Mercury's quite happy to lie. And so again, I really wanted to play with that. And Walter Moody, the man who arrives at the very beginning of the book and kind of begins the story, provides the kind of mercurial force in the book, because it's the characters telling him their story, narrating it to him, that enables the mystery to eventually become to get solved. But of course, he has a deceitful part to play as well, which I can't talk about in case I spoil it. But anyway, so that kind of gives you a picture of the how many forces there are at work in the zodiac as a psychological artifact. And I haven't even talked about the 12 signs and how they relate to one another. You know, how they, as you move around the wheel, how each sign responds to the one before, and in a sense revises the one before, and how there are miniature sequences. First of all, a first and a second act, where the first and a second testament maybe, where the first half of the zodiac is mirrored with an important difference in the second. And then secondly, there are 4 quadrants around the wheel, each of which divides into a perfect story of 3 signs each, a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. You know, it's all you need for a story is 3 elements, 3 progressions. And the zodiac does that 4 times. So anyway, you know, like I've kind of gone a long way away from character, I guess, but the zodiac gave me so much to work with, because there's so much psychological richness there already, that really it was just like it was kind of like casting a play in a funny kind of way. You know, like if I ask everybody in the room to think of what Hamlet looks like, but you're not allowed to think of any Hamlet you've ever seen on stage. You just have to think of Hamlet, the guy. You know, who knows what we're all thinking? You know, probably we're not really thinking about anybody at all. It's quite shadowy. You know, it doesn't matter whether he's got blonde hair or black hair, or whether he's fat or thin. You know, it doesn't. Those things are immaterial. He's an archetype. He's a role.
What's so interesting to me hearing you talk is I can hear the finesse and the detail in the structures, and also the abstraction. But my sense as a reader is that those characters are not at all abstracted. They're extremely concrete, and I felt like I knew them. I would know, you know, I knew what they sounded like. I could see what they were wearing. I had a very strong sense of what was motivating them, but they are they're very alive. They don't feel like they're built off of a set of quadrants and a ring. And
Right.
sometimes I think when we think about working with archetypes or working with sort of abstract structures, you get the sense that characters kind of perform roles, and they do, obviously, in terms of story, but your characters are also so finely drawn that they feel like they're actual people and not abstractions that are performing story roles.
Oh, that's great to hear. I do think it's very important to love your characters. I always feel really offended when people say that they didn't like somebody in my book, and it's not. It's interesting because people can say that they didn't like my book, and I don't feel offended at all. But if they say they didn't like somebody in it, then I really have a problem with it. It's kind of like they. I have 2 cats who I kind of am madly in love with, and it's when people come around and don't praise my cats to the adequate level, I also get very angry. To try kind of, giving them compliments, saying, "Doesn't she look, Is there something you want to comment on?
So don't listen for a second. If you talk to her about her book, make sure that you like all the characters, just in case you didn't catch that.
But your characters they're all a part of you in a way, and they should be. Like I think that the worst thing that a writer can do is to condescend to the reader. I think that's the absolute worst thing that a writer can do. But a very close second and very similar is condescending to a character. And I think that took me quite a long time to learn. I think. I don't think that I'd quite gotten there in my first book yet. I think that my first book was maybe a little bit more immature in that regard, where it was actually reading the 19th century novels. I read just as much 19th century fiction as I could get my hands on, and in preparation to begin to kind of work my way into the era, I suppose. I'm trying to kind of absorb the rhythms and the diction of the time, and those books are the characters. Isabel Archer, Anna Karenina, like they're. I feel such love for them. I feel more of a connection to them than I do a lot of real people in my life. And I think the novels of that era taught me that actually if you can get your reader to fall in love with your characters, then that's you're giving them the greatest pleasure that a book can give.
I agree with that. I noticed as I was reading, I was often pausing and folding down the corner of the page for oof. But I think what often caught my attention as I was reading is that even if I was reading someone that wasn't necessarily central in that scene or that that set of transactions, there are these little asides that were so astute about motivation or about a person's sense of their own character. So I felt like one of the things that you offered me as a reader was that I got to pause very often and kind of be really with the interior of a lot of your characters. I wondered, did it make you a bit crazy inhabiting so many people at the same time?
Oh, well, they were really inhabiting me.
No. Is that better?
Yeah, yes. Well, no, I don't know. Yeah, yes to the crazy part. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in creating the 12 men of the zodiac, I felt it was important to show as much as I could the ethnic breakdown of what Hokitika would have been like more or less at that time. I did cheat a little bit in the sense that I included 2 Chinese characters, the Virgo and Aquarius, if you're interested, both are Chinese characters. And I cheated with history in the sense that I brought forward the Chinese presence in Hokitika by about 3 or 4 years. The reason was just that I was writing a murder mystery, and opium is so wonderful for mysteries because that's really great if you can get people not remembering things that they did. That's wonderful. And it's also kind of sinister in an interesting way. The other reason, which is kind of more of a thematic reason, I guess, is that when I was researching opium use in the 19th century, I read for the first time about the Opium Wars and the horrible, horrible facts of those wars. You know, the equivalent nowadays would be, I mean, we're probably seeing the equivalent nowadays with, you know, corporations feeding you the very thing that they know is terrible for you, but it's because they want you to get hooked on their product. You know, this was happening in this just hideous scale in the 1840s, and so I wanted to use that as well. And obviously, it was very important to have a Māori presence in the book. There's only one Māori character in the zodiac. I gave him the place of Aries, the first sign, because that felt important. And so I kind of, in looking at the wheel as a whole, I realized how vital it was to be neutral in the sense of how deep I was going to go into everybody's character, and you know, I had help in the sense that each of them is modelled on an archetype, and so I had a lot to work with. And I was also, you know, in my mind, I was kind of reacting against, I guess, a lot of tokenism that I think that you see in ensemble cast stories, where particularly the non-white characters are given one attribute. I mean, that's what stereotyping is. They're reduced to one thing, right. And it's usually something that you could predict before you even began the book. So that was kind of interesting, and it was really scary. Actually, it was that was the scariest thing about the book. It was much more difficult in a funny kind of way than getting the structure to work. I mean, it was much more revealing of me.
Say more about that.
Well, I mean, I have complicated feelings about people telling other people's stories, and how I justified it to myself was that I thought, okay, I can, if I make up a story, and I tell it in the third person, and my ultimate goal is to write a good mystery and to write a good novel and to kind of to honor the form. This form that I've kind of want to devote my life to trying to figure out, then I think it's okay to include the experiences of other people. But I would never. I feel that I don't want to speak for anybody else and say this is what all writers should or shouldn't do. But I feel that there's something very problematic about, especially first-person stories that are told from a position that somebody doesn't know. You know, and it's interesting because, you know, in writing the book, I was trying as hard as I could to embody and utilize the language of the 19th century. I was trying to write a 19th century novel insofar as I could, but I'm not a 19th century person. You know, I don't.
That's true.
I don't believe in empire, for example. I don't believe that women should go to asylums for reading novels, or, you know, all sorts of things. You know, there's in terms of my value system, I'm absolutely not a Victorian. So there was a funny kind of dance that I had to do where I wanted to use the tropes and trappings of the form, but I also wanted to criticize it. I guess the most obvious example of that in the book is that in my reading, I had this horrible month of reading about 5 years ago, and early on in the writing of the book, where I read, this is in sequence, so quite by accident actually, Anna Karenina, Madame Bovary, The House of Mirth, The Portrait of a Lady, and then some other. Anyway, all the women either died or met a hideous tragic ending at the end. Most of them died, and most of them committed suicide. And I started wondering, why is it that this so often happens in these 19th century novels, that these wonderful, rich, interesting, real characters have to die? Why do they have to die? And the theory that I came to, or the conclusion that I came to, was that in that time, there was nothing scarier than a woman who was complex and who had her eyes wide open, who was alive to herself. That was too scary. It was too powerful. The novel couldn't support it. They had to shut her down, And so I thought from the very beginning, I want to have my main character, my main female character, I want everybody in the town to be convinced that she has probably tried to kill herself, and that they couldn't possibly imagine any other fate. They couldn't imagine why she would not want to have killed herself, because obviously she's so wretched and she's a prostitute, and that's awful, and wouldn't she just want to, just end her days, But that, I kind of wanted to critique that tradition, I guess. And then by the end of the book, Anna Wetherill, the character in question, is actually in a more powerful position than anybody, which was again kind of something that felt important to me.
I think that's one of the things that is so exciting about this book for me, is that it has a feel of observing tradition and mining the richness of those early novels, and it's set in an early time, an earlier time. So the feel as a reader is that you have this opportunity to go traipsing through, for me, a totally exotic place and time. And I don't know anything about gold rush life, but it was pretty cool to go wandering around in there. And at the same time, there's a feel in this novel for me that it has a real relevance and currency, because it is also, I think, investigating and maybe critiquing empire, and critiquing and investigating cultural relations and sexism, and the ways that all those conventions and manners kind of crash into the power in the characters. I loved the women characters, but I also really loved those Chinese characters, and I loved the Maori character. I liked that there was a kind of, it did feel like a dance, like there were many potential dance partners, and we kind of kept moving around between them and seeing how they were often a little bit blind to one another, because they didn't know how deeply they could see into one another. They were in some ways blinded by their conventions and by their time, but we as readers were not. So I thought that was a very exciting for me.
Well, that's a nice way of putting it. I think that in a way that speaks to something that I most love about the zodiac, actually, or that astrology as a system, that it is entirely and absolutely relational, that nothing makes sense in and of itself. Things only ever make sense in context. So when you talk about the forces embodied in each of the planets, we in everybody's natal chart, or at any point in any time, if you look up at the night sky and cast a chart, each of these 7 planets will be in one of the 12 houses, which are associated with one of the 12 signs, and they'll have this very, very complex interrelation that is changing. Every 4 minutes, the spin of the Earth means that one degree clocks round. And the coolest analogy that I can think of to illustrate this is actually with music. In Western music, we have obviously the octave, which forms the base of the key signature of any piece. So you have 7 natural notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But on top of those 7 natural notes, you have, or 7 tones, 7 intervals, you have 12 semitones. So if you try and get from that A to the A above, you'll make 12 leaps on the piano. There's 13 keys, 5 black notes, 7 white notes, but 12 jumps between them. And so you've got a 12 and a 7, which is exactly the same as astrology. And where in the key signature of any piece will give you 7 intervals, 7 notes. Any piece, no piece confines itself to those 7 notes. Every piece makes use of the 12. And so you have these very interesting intervals like, I don't know, the diminished 7th or even the major 5th or anything like this that are making use of little patterns within the bigger patterns in the way that astrology does, I read this really amazing book quite recently, which was Conversations between Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim, the pianist. It's very interesting because an Israeli and a Palestinian in conversation with one another. And Daniel Barenboim said about music, he said, I never know, and I will never know, whether the Western scale, the 12-tone scale, is something that we've created or something that's inherently true. He said, some days I feel it's one way, and some days I feel it's the other way. I will never know. And I kind of feel the same way about astrology, actually. I think that it's equally interesting. I think that if we've created it, it's equally interesting than if it is inherently true. And I'm quite happy to not know.
Can you say a little bit about, you've talked about research, and I want to sort of tie that to your sense of your interest in astrology. Is that something that you researched in order to create this book, or have you been, kind of compelled by astrology since you were little?
No, not at all, actually. My dad's a very keen astronomer, and so we always had telescopes around, and trips to observatories and that kind of thing was kind of a part of my childhood, to my extreme displeasure as a child. He used to, when I was so embarrassing, whenever I was having sleepovers and trying to impress all my girlfriends, he would come in and he would have set up his telescope already. He was very cunning. And he'd say, he had this one line, he'd say, "Who wants to see a globular cluster?" And I'd be like, "Dad, you're killing me." And then his next line was, 1 million stars in one squiz. That's what he would say. It was hideous. Yeah, but no, I think that this was just a peculiar thing for this project, and it developed out of a curiosity that I had for archetypes, and I through Jung I actually got to astrology that way. And did a whole lot of reading. Most of it extremely disreputable, online and that kind of thing. And I'll leave it there. Yeah, and so I think that it was just something that fed into this work. It wasn't something that predated it really. I think.
So you're not going to do our charts if we ask you?
Oh, I could if you like. Yeah. Yeah. It's reading patterns. Is all it is really. It's very like any kind of reading. I think that most readers would be very good chart readers, or if you just know a little bit about astrology and what the various elements mean. When I was at grad school, I began writing the luminaries in Iowa. I was studying at the University of Iowa, and a bunch of my friends and I all learned to read tarot cards, and which was great fun. We just did it to do at a bar, But I really recommend it for any writer. It's such an interesting thing to do, because what you're doing is just reading pictures. You're looking at two pictures and saying, okay, this one has a low horizon line and this one has a high horizon line, and we're moving left to right. So what does that say about this person sitting in front of me? You know, and you're just interpreting what it is that you see and turning it into a story. And so I think that a lot of astrology is like that. You know, again, I think it's very like the Daniel Barenboim comment that I should say that, you know, obviously everybody in this room has a star sign. It's one of those things that's a great leveler, you know, you can't escape it. But if anybody here was to tell me what their star sign was, you can play this, this is a trick you can play on your friends actually. That if you tell me what your star sign is, doesn't matter what it is, I'll say, oh, that means you're really stubborn. Say this to all your friends. Everybody will say, yes, I'm very stubborn. You know, and the reason is that we all identify as being stubborn, because those of us who are quiet identify with being quietly stubborn and principled, and those of us who are very loud, you know, obviously do too. And nobody thinks, stubborn? No, I'm a bit of a pushover, actually. That's inaccurate, you know. Or, you know, so stubborn? No, I don't hold to my beliefs. Actually, I don't really, you know, I don't have very much integrity. You know, like nobody responds in that way. And I think a lot of astrology is like that. And I don't think it's to the discredit of the field that it's like that. I think it's just a very interesting thing about human beings, that we do receive the information we want to receive and discard the rest. And we also will receive a flattering picture of ourselves much more readily than we will receive an unflattering one. You know, which isn't to say that all astrology needs to be respected, because a lot of it's very silly.
I just think I'm hearing a kind of connection to the piece that you read tonight about the sense of fortune telling and seance, and how it's not necessarily specifically predictive, but it is connected to being able to read the stories that are unfolding in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, it was useful. Lydia Wells was a useful character for me, because she represents Venus as her archetype, and so obviously to do with desire and manipulating that desire. And so she could also be a kind of a mouthpiece in the book for ideas about fortune that were very overt. Which isn't to say she's really my mouthpiece, but she just kind of provided a nice catalyst for those conversations to happen. But yeah, I mean, I think that fate and the will are very interesting. It's a very interesting thing to think about. This kind of paradoxical relation that they're locked in. It seems to me that because all of us have free will, we can defy fate. You know, nobody knows what I'm about to do next, or any of us are about to do next. Anybody could do a bizarre thing right now, and that would surely not be fated if we just in this instant willed ourselves to do it. But then, surely, if fate is real, then surely fate makes a mockery of the will. You know, and I think that I was interested in the interplay of these things in the context of a goldfield in particular. Because I started noticing in the literature of the time, and also still in the way that we talk about quote-unquote making your fortune. I mean, surely it's your fortune that makes you. You know, it's kind of curiously reversed. It struck me that how strange it is that we tend to talk about people who've gotten rich as self-made, but we don't talk about people who've been transformed in any other way as self-made. So if somebody, for example, became a really excellent cook, we wouldn't say that they were a self-made man. We'd just say they were a good cook. But if they were a good cook who got rich, then we would say then they were a self-made man. And, you know, all of these things that are much more transformative than getting rich. I mean, you know, like having relationships and reading and kind of expanding yourself. None of this qualifies in our way of talking about it. And that seemed just really peculiar to me, that we would afford such importance to money, to say that by getting rich you actually you acquire these kind of godlike powers to make yourself, to have made yourself. It's nuts, I think.
And that goes back to the thing you said at the very front about the sort of the relationship between worth and value as one of the central principles. Will you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, you know, there are a lot of mirrorings that in the novel. Twinship is at the heart of the novel in a lot of ways. So it was, in kind of laying down the pattern of the plot, it was important for me to have, to plant opposites everywhere I could, and to plant and then bury opposites. So, for example, there are two documents that are very important to the machine of the plot. One is a deed of sale, and one is a deed of gift. So they kind of mirror one another. And just like I was talking before about Anna's plight in the book, people, all the men around her feeling that it is so obvious that she must have tried to commit suicide when, and in fact, the truth is not that. I also wanted to kind of draw a different distinction between a sale, a transaction, and a gift. This comes back to Lewis Hyde's extraordinary book, The Gift, which is my most bought book of all time because I just am constantly buying it and giving it away. You must give it away. It's one of the rules. But these are ideas that he talks about in this book, economies of worth and value, and what happens when you give something away. As opposed to sell it, you know. When you give something away, something gets bigger. You defy all of the laws of nature. You know, you defy the laws of thermodynamics by giving. It's you know, things don't just taper out as they do with you know, capitalism, the law of diminishing returns. You know, it's not the idea of a gift is transformative, and I really strongly believe that money can't transform you. It's incapable of doing that. We want to believe that it can really badly. Mm-hmm. We tell ourselves that it can. We say self-made man, and we say a person makes their own luck, and you know, we say all these grand things. But the only thing that can transform anybody is if they love and are loved, I think. I can't remember your question. I'm sorry, I've gone very far away from it.
I can't remember the question after that either. But I actually want to just pause there and say the sense of being given a gift is I hadn't thought about it exactly this way, but I think this is what I experience when I read. It's like even if I've purchased a book, the feel of being inside a story that someone has made, inside a crafted thing, that is an experience of being enriched by someone else's giving.
Yeah. I read a statistic online that people who read a lot have this belief that they have a lot more friends than they actually do, and it really resonated with me because I feel kind of incredibly popular, and then I look around the actual people in my life and think, single digits, you know. This is anyway. But yeah, no, I do think that reading is, I mean, you're forming a relationship. You're forming a relationship with a book. You end up having a relationship with a book. And the wonderful thing about a book is that that relationship changes over your life, just like it does with a person. You know, there's that thing that everyone says that you read Middlemarch in every decade of your life, and every time you read it, it's a completely different story. You feel into a different character's plight.
My one sadness is I don't get to read this book in my 40s and my 30s and my 20s, but I look forward to reading it in my 60s and my 70s. And I have to say that you are now in the company of more than single-digit friends. Would you not say that's true?
Oh, that's very kind.
Please, will you join me in thanking Eleanor Catton for a lovely, lovely conversation tonight?
Thank you. Thank you for coming.